Happy Saturday morning. What a year this week has been. I wanted to acknowledge, especially given that I'm about to talk to you about diversity and inclusivity, which feels very poignant at the moment, that the events of this week have been very hard for many of us, and that the stories and topics that have flooded the news cycle will have been very difficult to deal with for many people in this room. So I'm sorry, and thank you for making it out today. I wanted to start by telling you the story of this person. This is Ben Barres. He's a neuroscientist at Stanford University, or he was. He sadly passed away at the end of last year. Ben did a lot of work on glia, cells that are in the brain, and provide an extremely important role in influencing the lives of neurons and the way we think, the way our brains work. Thanks to Ben, we understand more about how important a role glia play in human biology. And Ben was also notable not just for his work as a neuroscientist, but for his work as a champion of diversity. He has been described by some as a role model for role models. While doing scientific talks, he would often talk about matters of diversity. He once said to a group of people at a conference in Lake Arrowhead, "Since I have you all trapped on top of this mountain, I would like to talk about the many barriers that women face in science." Ben knew those barriers well because he was a transgender neuroscientist. He was, in fact, I think one of the first, or perhaps the first transgender scientist to be elected to the National Academies of Science. And so he knew firsthand the experiences that women in science face and how different those were to the experiences that he underwent after his transition. He once said that by far the main difference that I've noticed is that people who don't know I'm transgender treat me with much more respect, and I can even complete a whole sentence without being interrupted by a man. I've been thinking about Ben a lot recently as I reflect on my own work and the work that all of us who have a role in communicating about science to the public have. A few years ago, at the end of 2015, I was at a conference about CRISPR, the gene editing technology. And I wrote a write-up about that conference at The Atlantic. And after that write-up came out, someone on Twitter quite rightly called me out for the fact that out of, I think, the 7 people who I quoted in this story, 6 were men. Only 1 was a woman. And the sense in which they were quoted was very different. The men were all quoted for their scientific expertise, the woman as a representative for a patient group. And this is especially galling because CRISPR is a field that was arguably co-founded by at least 2 women. This is Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna, 2 pioneers of this field, both of whom spoke at this conference, neither of whom were quoted in my piece. And I think about this a lot because shortly after this piece came out, a colleague of mine named Adrienne Lafrance, who is an incredible reporter at The Atlantic and is now the head of our entire website, did this exercise where she analyzed a year of her own reporting for gender bias. This was the 2nd year in a row she had done that. She had looked over a full year of her stories and looked at what proportion of women she was quoting compared to men. And she found that that women made up 25% of the sources in her story. The men in her pieces were outnumbering the women whom she was giving a voice to by a factor of 3 to 1. I also did the same exercise after Adrienne's piece came out. And I found exactly the same ratio, 25%, 3 to 1. And this turns out to be kind of common for the entire media industry. Whenever people have done this exercise in repeated settings across publications, and regardless of whether the journalist is male or female themselves, this is the sort of figure that comes out. We're vastly overrepresenting the men whom we quote in our work. And this matters. It matters to me, it matters to Adrienne. In the piece that she wrote, analyzing what she had, looking at this analysis that she had done, she wrote that by failing to quote or mention very many women, I am one of the forces actively contributing to a world in which women's skills and accomplishments are undermined or ignored, and in which women are excluded. That world has been pretty much in our faces this week, and is the lived reality for many people who work in science. Remember everything that Ben Barres said. Women in science face long-standing stereotypes about their scientific acumen, about their knowledge and their expertise. They are viewed as less competent and employable as equally qualified men. They receive less mentoring. They're invited to fewer talks. They earn less than their male colleagues. And on top of all of that nonsense, they also face significant amounts of harassment and abuse. For anyone who wants to know, I can provide citations to empirical studies for all of these statements, but I would also prefer if we just listened to our colleagues who have lived through these all the time. And everything that I've just said applies doubly so for women of color and for people who lie at the intersection of many different marginalized groups. Those of you here who work in science and technology centers are very invested and interested in getting young people interested in science. But in many ways, that is not the problem in terms of inequity and inequality. Getting girls interested in science isn't where the shortfall lies. It's getting them to stay in science. It's getting them, once they are part of that pipeline, to not leave, to not be pushed out, to see a place for themselves in this world. A recent study looked at something like 10 million academic papers and looked at the ratio of male to female authors within those papers and how that ratio has changed over time. It concluded that it will take 16 years for the number of men and women in science in terms of publishing to equalize. And of course, that varies significantly from field to field. Some are doing much better than others. In areas such as in physics and in mathematics, it will take more like 258 years for the number of men and women publishing papers to be equal, which means that no living physicist will see equity in their lifetimes or in their grandchildren's. This is unacceptable to me, and I would hope that many of you would feel the same way. The imbalances in science and the stereotypes and biases that perpetuate them not only have huge consequences for who gets to do science in the first place, but very much so on the type of science that gets done. I write a lot about the field of animal behavior and about evolutionary biology. And it is very obvious the ways in which gender biases in science and sexist stereotypes affect the way science gets done in this field. There is a lot of interest in the topic of sexual selection and in the evolution of courtship rituals and genital anatomy in animals. If you look at studies of the evolution of animal genitals, 49% look at male genitals alone, 8% only at women. If you look at 8% at female only. If you look at studies of sexual selection, male behaviors are described in aggressive, active terms, in terms of things like intimidation and coercion. Female behaviors are described in terms of passive terms, like resistance and avoidance. Males have adaptations, females have counter-adaptations. Males act, females react. This is not just a thing about phrasing. It's not like a linguistic thing we can ignore. The point is that if you do not have a world in which women and female individuals have agency, you do not look for the things that they can do. And this is very true when you look at studies of animal behavior, dating back to long-standing patriarchal Victorian attitudes, when male scientists believed that female whims were so fickle that they couldn't possibly act as consistent agents of natural selection. And for that reason, the study of things like sperm competition, a topic that is very interesting, far outcompeted and has been going on for much longer than studies of female choice. And yet, when we look at the way animals behave, we see that female animals have a huge influence on the mating process in terms of the amount of choice they have, in terms of interesting ways of manipulating male animals, in terms of storage organs and cool scrapers and interesting bits of anatomy, none of which would be obvious if you weren't looking for it in the first place. This is one of my favorite stories in this field. This is a woman named Patricia Brennan who studied the sex lives of ducks. It turns out that ducks have a really fascinating sex life. Things you didn't know on a Saturday morning. Male ducks have a hyperextensible ballistic corkscrew-shaped penis, which they insert quite explosively into the female during mating. The female has a corkscrew vagina that twists in the opposite direction, allowing her to control through posture how successful the male is in pushing the penis inside her genital tract. This story and a lot of the visuals that accompanied it became kind of a classic in the field of science communication. But in many ways, it became a duck penis story, when in fact it is very much a duck vagina story. It is a story of female choice and female control. And it is exactly the type of thing that you don't see if you aren't looking for that choice, and if you aren't thinking about female individuals as creatures of agency in their own right. This is Emily Martin. She is a cultural anthropologist, and she did similar work exposing some of the biases and stereotypes that affect our understanding of the fertilization process, of how sperm and egg meet together. There is this idea of sperm racing each other and the best sperm outcompeting all the others in an attempt to fertilize the egg. And in this narrative, it's all about male power and speed, and the egg is a passive receptacle for that power and speed. And Martin made the point that that's actually kind of nonsense. Sperm are really crappy swimmers, and they're basically just blundering about. And the egg, in fact, releases hormones that give sperm a power boost and therefore acts in a very active way in the process of conception. Again, the biases and stereotypes that we have affect the science that gets done, the questions that we ask, the way we interpret those results. Is it any coincidence that this was the man who showed that glia, a group of cells that make up half the brain, but have long been underestimated and neglected and deemed to play a supporting role, were actually super important? I don't think so. The last time I talked about this to an audience much like you, someone came up to me afterwards and said, "I think you have made a grave epistemological error." And I was like, oh boy, here we go. His point, which I've heard a lot, is that science is an objective process. It is empirical, and this whole point of the scientific method is to cut a slice through all of these personal biases that you keep talking about, and that, as a result, science should be free of those biases, and that really all of this isn't very much of a problem. This is the beautiful lie of science, that it is an effective barrier against bias. It is not. As I've said, the science that gets done is a product of the culture in which we live, and all the biases that exist within those cultures. The scientific method is indeed a way of cutting through some of that, but it is, like any tool, an imperfect one. It can be wielded by an artisan or by a drunken monkey. And the other lie about science, which is not quite so beautiful, is that because the method is meant to be objective and empirical, that scientists themselves, by nature, are also objective, empirical, and free of these kinds of societal biases. And it is not so. The science that we do is a product of the cultures that we are actively creating all the time. Those cultures dictate who gets to be a scientist in the first place, and those people then dictate the science that gets done. So what, I ask you, have we missed out on because large groups of people have been shunned, neglected, not listened to, silenced, or abused? What discoveries, what amazing discoveries were never made because a female PhD student or a black kid or a trans teenager took one step into this world and saw no place for themselves within it? I would ask everyone in this room to think about this, and I would especially ask you to think about it if any of what I've said has made you feel uncomfortable. Perhaps because you don't fit those descriptions, perhaps because you belong to what may be thought of as a majority group. I would ask you to own that discomfort, to let go of any sense of defensiveness, and to think about the privileges that you may have been afforded and the power that those privileges give you. As a great philosopher once said, with great power comes great responsibility. I think it was Wittgenstein who said that, probably. And I think about this a lot in my role as part of the media. In many ways, it is similar to yours as leaders of science centers. We are gatekeepers. We provide knowledge to other people, and we give people voices. We decide who gets to have a voice, whose work, whose names, whose faces are represented to the public when they see, when they read, when they listen to stories about science. So what can we do? Well, this is what I did. After learning that I quote men over women by a factor of 3, I started keeping track of the numbers of male and female sources in every one of the stories that I did in a spreadsheet, a very simple one. And I made active efforts to try and redress that balance by finding more female sources, by reaching out to more of them, by making an effort to quote them more in the pieces that I wrote. It took some effort, but it did not take all that much effort. It took some time, but not that much time. And it was remarkably easy to change. Within 4 months, I was quoting men and women in my stories in equal numbers, and that has been the case for the last 2 years and more. And I keep that spreadsheet now to hold myself to account. I've long thought of myself as someone who cares about these issues. I would have self-identified as a feminist 2 years ago if you'd asked me. And I think my mistake was in thinking that that concern, that passive concern would be enough, which is why I was shocked when I saw that 25% figure. Passive concern is never enough. You need to take action. Through the choices we make, we are either fighting against inequity or we are exacerbating it. Those are the choices. There is no middle ground. Through our inaction, we are doing the latter. And so we should I would ask all of us here to think hard about the steps that we can take in order to change the way the world is. The spreadsheet that I created was very much a way of holding myself to account, and very much still is. It is a way of looking at how well I'm doing so that I'm unable to bullshit myself that everything is fine. This work, this goal of quoting men and women in equal numbers is vital to me. It is a way of exercising my responsibility as a gatekeeper more responsibly. Some people who are skeptical of this approach sometimes say, why don't you just pick people based on quality? Why don't you just focus on the most qualified sources rather than looking at things like gender? It's kind of a nonsense argument that irritates the shit out of me, partly for two reasons. Firstly, quality isn't like a metric that I can measure. I can't like rank people by quality, put them like in a list in descending order and then pick them off through the top. Every person who I talk to is well qualified to speak to the stories that I'm asking them about. It just so happens that now half of those people are women. Secondly, where was all this talk about quality in the status quo when most of the sources in my stories and in everyone else's stories were men? Where was all this hand-wringing and concern about whether we are getting the most qualified people then? And why is that only a thing that gets raised when people make efforts to redress societal balances? Thank you for understanding that that was a rhetorical question. Sometimes not everyone gets that. There are other things we can do. I think a lot about the people whose voices I'm amplifying on social media, who they are, what they're writing about. When I come to conferences like this, before accepting speaking gigs, I try and ask whether what organizers are doing to think about things like diversity and equity. I turn down speaking gigs that involve panels that are almost entirely male. I've turned down speaking gigs that are part of lecture series that have been entirely male. All of these things are ways in which all of us can think about redressing these imbalances. Everyone in this room has power in some way. We are all able to think about who we are giving a boost to, who we are putting on stage in an exhibit, whose voices we are cheering on, even in meetings with our colleagues, whom we are interrupting, whom we are giving more chances to speak, whom we are promoting into positions of power and responsibility themselves. And while I focused a lot on the topic of gender in this talk, I would also encourage everyone to remember that we are either intersectional or we are failing, and to think about how these issues go along lots of different lines of inequity and how they affect a lot of other marginalized groups. I also want to finish by talking about ways in which thinking about these issues can make a difference to people's lives. My partner is Liz Neely, the executive director of a wonderful organization called Story Collider. That's her on the left and her artistic director, Erin Barker, on the right. Story Collider gets people, scientists and people adjacent to science, to tell true personal stories about science on live stage shows and in their podcast. And they have thought very heavily about who they are inviting to those shows, whose voices they are giving a chance to speak. Recently, if you look at their shows, if you look at their podcasts, you will find diversity in many different forms. You will find people who are immigrants, people with disabilities, people from all kinds of racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. Recently, a psychologist named Jeff Shinsky did a study at a community college where he had students listen to Story Collider stories and those from some other sources that were specifically selected to highlight scientists from a diverse set of economic, gender, racial, sexual orientation, and national backgrounds. Ben Barres was one of the people whose stories he picked. And after a semester of listening to these stories, the students had a different view of what science is and who a scientist could be. People said things like, it makes me more confident in becoming a scientist myself. It gave me incentive to push for my own dreams and to succeed. Many of them felt that they saw a place for themselves in science because of the stories of the people whom they got to hear. And that is the power, I think, that everyone in this room shares, to think about who we are giving a platform to and who is out there listening to the results of our efforts. Thank you very much.